topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Well, hello and welcome. I'm glad you could join us. Well, I'll tell you, we're going to be dealing with an interesting topic, and it's one of the top 10, I think, conspiracies of the modern era that has been brain-bruising Americans since 9/11. We're talking about the World Trade Centers and how they came down. Well, Richard Gage and I finally reconnected. And I say finally reconnected because he's been on my mind and heart for many years since I first interviewed him back in August of 2014, when he brought his evidence and his reporting to bear against the narrative that we were being told about what happened on 9/11. So we're talking 11 years ago when I first interviewed Richard Gage. He's a San Francisco Bay Area architect with 3 decades of experience. He's a member of the American Institute of Architects. He's regarded as one of the top, if not the most prestigious architect in the country. Best known as the founder and former CEO of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, AE 9/11 Truth for short. It's a nonprofit organization established in 2006 that calls for a new investigation into the destruction of the World Trade Center towers. Now, this is based on the assertion that the buildings were brought down by controlled demolition rather than solely by the impact of the planes and resulting fires. Now, over 2 decades later, maybe America is ready for the truth. Richard Gage, welcome to the show. Good to have you with us.
Thank you so very much, Bill. Awesome to be here with you. And I think we are going to find out if controlled demolition brought these towers down in a matter of minutes. So don't go anywhere, you guys. We're going to prove this point.
You know, it was interesting, Rich, because after you and I talked some 11 years ago, there was an incident. I believe it was in Spain. It was a multi-story building. I don't know, I want to say 16, 18 stories. And, in light of what you and I talked about how long it would take to bring a building down if it was by fire only, a case in point was what happened in Spain. The building was still burning 2 weeks later, but yet we're supposed to believe that in an hour and a half or 2 hours, you've got 2 multi-layered structures there in New York, the World Trade Center, that went down, and it fell into its own footprint.
Yeah,
just a couple.
And a third one too. Bill, a
Yes.
third one came down as well.
Right.
And well, I'm going to show you a half a dozen building high-rise fire-protected steel structures that have never come down due to fires, even though there were much larger, longer-lasting fires in these buildings.
Well, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'll have you bring the evidence. And because you've been on this since day one. And like I said, since 2006, you've been calling into an investigation into the destruction of the World Trade Centers, because with your background and the background of other architects, this didn't make sense. They really have insulted people such as yourself who are experts, but certainly the American people, in believing that this was all done because of airplane fuel.
Yes. Let me show you that wasn't and couldn't be the case. So,
Right.
if we can put those slides up, we will go through this. This takes a little courage, Bill. People don't realize that the implications of the explosive demolition of all 3 towers are dark and vast for our country. Think of the conspiracy that this entails. So prepare psychologically, people, for what we're talking about. First, let's jump into the The third tower, a 47-story skyscraper that I didn't know anything about. I'm one of 90,000 members of the American Institute of Architects. We didn't get one bulletin on this, the third worst structural failure in modern history after the Twin Towers. I mean, it was 47 stories tall, easily the tallest building in most of our states. It looks dwarfed next to the tallest buildings in the world at the time they were built, the Twin Towers. But this is no slouching building. It did get hit with some of the beams that came from the North Tower when it went down that morning. But 7 hours later, this building collapsed. And I'll show you that. But NIST says that damage was not a significant factor in the building's collapse. Well, let's look at the collapse. This is 5:20 in the afternoon. After witnesses hear explosions, the east penthouse just came down in the upper left, and 6 seconds later, this happens. Well, wait a minute. Have we seen this before?
Yes.
You know, like the old hotels
casinos in Vegas going down.
Yeah, it's exact replica, in fact. But NIST says no. Here's what they say.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Fires? Well, my gosh. NIST, by the way, is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. What did they say? Well, fires brought the building. Well, let's look at those fires. These are the fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in the building. As you can see, they're few, they're small, and they're scattered throughout the building. So we have to go, well, wait a minute. Let's examine this. NIST says, well, in the northeast corner, this column 79, the beams pushed a girder off of its seat on this column and caused a progressive collapse. And then that traveled to the right, which is the west in this case. And but look at the photographs. They completely betray the reality of these fires being on that floor in this area. They've been burnt out. In fact, they were burnt out well an hour before the building ever collapsed. So they could not have caused the thermal expansion of those long span beams, as NIST claims. I mean, look at real fires in high rises.
Right.
Never lost one of them. Not one. I mean, this one's burning 3.5 hours over 5 floors, 18 hours over 8 floors. As you mentioned, well, in this case, Venezuela, 17 hours over 26 floors. But look at these. Since 9/11, we've had much hotter, larger, and longer lasting fires in these buildings. Not one of them has come down. So NIST's theory is unprecedented. And so we have to ask ourselves, well, what is precedented? What could it be? And we can just compare side by side. Building 7 on the right, a series of known controlled demolitions on the left. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never in history brought down a steel frame, fire-protected structure, which most skyscrapers are. So we have to ask ourselves, what are the features of controlled demolition? And does Building 7 have any of them? Turns out has all of them. A sudden onset of destruction. Let's listen to Dan Rather.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What was that, Dan?
Yeah, right.
He's using his intuition, right, to figure out this is what we should all be doing. But
it's common sense there, Richard, right? I mean, you say intuition, but it's common sense would tell you, based on your experience, this looks familiar to other things I've seen. But
exactly. We have a frame of reference for it, and yet so it's an apple, but they told us it's an orange. And take a look at, is the building coming down straight down? Feature number 2 of controlled demolition. Look from West Street, pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. How do you do that? Bill, you have to take out all of the core columns within a fraction, a few milliseconds of each other. And then about a second later, take all the perimeter columns out within a fraction of a second of each other. Taking the core out pulls the perimeter in on the building. And so you get a pile, and I'll show you that pile, that's centered in the building's footprint. Can these fires achieve that level of precision? Now, again, it's common sense, right? No. Right. If those charges don't go off, you can have some real problems in controlled demolitions like this one. And this one where the charges stop at the bottom and the building, somebody has to go back into that building and set and fix those charges. Ain't going to be me. And yet these fires in the lower left of this building, centering around column 79 up here, are said to have caused that symmetricality. Well, look, when buildings are damaged on one side, like the northeast corner in the case of Building 7, you'd expect something like this. And
exactly,
that's not good. But that's not what happened, right? So how fast is the building coming down? Feature number 4 talks about free fall acceleration. In fact, David Chandler, physics teacher, measured it. And he and others did too, and NIST even acknowledged this building came down at free fall. That's as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky. Well, the bowling ball has no resistance. This building had 40,000 tons of structural resistance, 3 to 5 times stronger than it needed to be to hold this building up for its life. It shouldn't have gone anywhere. So finally, NIST was just forced to acknowledge this after having denied it for years. And they say, okay, it came down at free fall for at least a third of its 7-second fall, which there shouldn't be any free fall if those being. What does that mean? That means not one of these columns gave any resistance during that period of free fall. Exactly. A third of this building's 7-second fall. Now, where did they go? Did those fires take them away? Did they remove all those columns at once? Again, we're talking about common sense here, resulting in what? The total dismemberment of the building. Here's the pile. It is 6 stories tall and centered in the building's footprint. It falls like a house of cards. This was a moment-resisting steel frame building where the columns and beams are very rigidly welded one to another. So what happened to all of those connections? Here's some buildings that fell naturally, in this case by earthquakes, where the building is not, it's certainly recognizable as a building. And the columns and beams are not severed one from another. Yeah. No. The concrete's not pulverized to a fine powder, as we see in Building 7. So did these fires cause that kind of damage when earthquakes leave buildings like this and not fires have never brought? You see the problem that NIST is up against. They are between a rock and a hard place, especially when you listen to the witnesses who are witnesses of explosions, like Daryl, a medical student interviewed on the radio that evening.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. And then about a second later, the bottom floor caved out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
A second later, the building came down after a sound of a clap of thunder, a shockwave ripping through the building, the windows busting out. That's all before the building collapses. Kevin McPadden, former Air Force medic, was nearby. This is what his experience.
You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 boom. like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
Okay, it's getting more clear. And what did this gentleman, Bill Rosati, see?
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running
A big
everywhere,
flash.
chaotic.
Okay, and this gentleman, Barry Jennings, along with Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, went to a meeting. They were late. They didn't realize the whole building had been evacuated, and they got up to the 23rd floor, and they're told to get out of there. This is their experience on the way down.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions. You know,
what sort of sound?
like a boom, like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
And information of bombs, too?
Oh, bombs, yes. Wow. Yeah.
Like these bombs heard in the late morning of 9/11?
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
None of these explosions and witnesses of explosions were included in any of the NIST reports, including the Building 7, which came out 7 years after 9/11, when everybody who knew about it forgot about it, essentially. And that was the whole idea, producing 1,000 pages for this one building, a complete Potemkin village. Well, what do we have looking at the experts who have reviewed this, like 24 or 36 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth. Kamal Obaid, in this case from the San Francisco Bay Area, a localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Well, fascinating. Does that sound like something fire can do? So this caught the attention of one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, Professor Leroy Hulsey of the University of Alaska at Fairbanks. They did a 4-year study of this building with 2 competing software platforms to corroborate each other's results. And they did. They found that columns 79, 80, and 81 did not fail in their model, which was much more sophisticated a decade and a half later than NIST. And if they could fail, the building would have tipped over, which is what we know intuitively in the northeast corner, in this case, the right side. Yeah, it would tip over. So look at their model on the left when they took out all the columns compared to the video in the middle of the actual collapse. It's identical. Whereas NIST on the right in their computer model couldn't even back engineer their collapse mechanism to even look like the video of the collapse. Even though they're failing 400 structural steel connections every second inside the building, it still begins to crumple. And then it begins to tip over to the right. So they stop it after 2 seconds into the global collapse. And they don't want us to see it continuing to crumple and tip over. So they have betrayed their own theories. And so NIST says fire did not cause, the University of Alaska, fire did not cause the collapse of this building. The temperatures were not high enough to cause the weakening of the steel framing. Thermal expansion did not result in a loss of support for the beams and girders. The collapse of this building was a global failure involving what? The near simultaneous failure of all the columns in the building, not a progressive collapse as claimed by NIST. So we got to find out, well, because the University of Alaska didn't study the forensic evidence like we're going to do right now. They're
Right.
structural engineers. They
Yeah.
don't get into that. They would just want to know what didn't cause the collapse,
Right.
essentially.
Exactly. Yeah, this is common sense for structural engineers, right?
Yes, and they're the ones that have looked at this information have signed on to the petition,
Mhm.
or they're too concerned for their reputations to do so, because that happens a lot also. Because there's evidence of extreme heat, which involves an obvious conspiracy to set, in this case, incendiaries in the buildings before 9/11. I mean, we're talking evidence provided by the FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Association, in their May of 2002 Building Performance Assessment Team report. Appendix C documents the metallurgical examination of the steel. Well, what did they find in 2002? Never before observed. Intergranular melting, capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese. Office fires don't do this. And this is a piece of World Trade Center 7 steel. Office fires can't melt steel beams. They don't put holes in it. They don't do rapid oxidation and sulfidation. That's sulfur. They don't do liquid iron. That's molten iron. That's 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Office fires are only a quarter of that temperature typically. Where did this heat come from? Hot sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. They document it very well, Bill. But and the New York Times says that this is perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. But it was completely ignored by NIST. NIST threw out this information when they took over in 2002, producing their own report in 2008. And
Richard, why would NIST, I don't know, why would they report something like this when there was so much evidence to the contrary?
Well, they had a job to do, and their job was to support the official narrative, which was collapsed by fire. So they had to omit all the evidence we're going to see in the next few minutes, including steel beams in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated. Now,
right. But Richard, real quick here, let me, from a standpoint here, is that in 2001, what we're talking about now here, we're 24 years later, and some people may argue, say, well, Bill, Richard, the technology is so much better today, but even with the technology they knew in 2001, they should have known better, right?
Well, they did know better, but they didn't do better. And why did they not do better? Because they were paid to not do better. They were paid to cover up the crime of the century.
Who paid him? Who paid him?
I don't have that information. I'm just giving you forensic evidence that shows that it takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel. And yet it's been evaporated. And here it is pouring out of the material held in the crab claw excavator. We know the color of molten steel or iron by its color. We're exceeding 2,500 degrees. There's multiple avenues of supporting corroborative evidence here.
Right.
The worst fires,
Eric, we were told, jet fuel would melt the steel, but jet fuel doesn't get up to that level to melt steel, right?
Jet fuel can burn, according to this engineer firm, 600 degrees in open air. That's a quarter of the temperatures that we're documenting here. Right. So you see the problem for the official narrative. They have to ignore photos like this, which from the debris that of World Trade Center that prove that they're lying to us. And that's the bottom line. So what can produce these temperatures? Well, maybe thermite can. What is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, Thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Uh-oh. Because maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermite were used, it would explain the molten iron. This is elemental iron, not steel, that's been melted here. We haven't used iron in our skyscrapers for 100 years. Where's all the iron come from? Well, it comes from thermite. It also explains the extreme temperatures, 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, more than 4 times to 5 times the typical temperatures of office fires. And it would explain the presence of sulfur, which NIST did not explain. Sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. Well, would we find any evidence in the dust of the ignited incendiaries that we've been looking at evidence of in this extreme heat? Well, yeah, the U.S. Geological Survey, they find in their particle atlas of the World Trade Center dust 2005, billions of what? Previously molten, meaning 3,000 degrees, iron, the byproduct of thermite, microspheres. How do they get spherical? We'll come back to that. But they're so ubiquitous, about the diameter of a human hair on average. You can see them. The EPA says we don't know what these are, but they're used as a signature component to distinguish World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. Well, where do they come from? Oh, we don't know. So the studies show from the R.J. Lee Group, another environmental consulting firm doing studies on the dust, they comprise up to 6% of many of these samples. It's everywhere. Up to 4 tons altogether by extrapolation.
Wow.
So the R.J. Lee Group says these are formed during the event, not before by the welders putting the building together, not afterward by the iron workers taking the building apart, but during the event. Now, this is all very well documented from official sources. We're not making anything up here. Here's an experiment. We can find out where they come from. We can do an experiment. Experiment is the arbiter of competing hypotheses. Let's do one. Let's light some thermite. See what happens. Looks like thousands of sparks, but they cool and they fall into the pan as previously molten iron microspheres, exactly what we find in the World Trade Center dust. Why are they spherical? Well, aerosolized liquids or liquids under pressure, like explosions, aerosolize and become spherical because of the surface tension. That's what raindrops are. Also, we're getting somewhere. Let's continue our study of the dust and find out, is there any evidence of unignited thermite? That was all evidence of ignited thermite and can only be just that. Yeah, a team of 8 international scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen identifies all of these samples, 7 independently collected samples sent to them because people heard about their work, and they have all these curious red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other. So we know they're applied as a fluid. They thought they were paint. They looked like primer paint, right? But unlike primer paint, they're attracted by a magnet. So they go, whoa, this is a problem. Let's look at the red layer and find out what is in it. And what do they find? Aluminum and iron, the ingredients of thermite in all of these paint chips. Well, paint doesn't have those, it doesn't have aluminum in it. They get real curious, zoom in 50,000 times with an electron microscope. And what do they find? iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. These particles are nano particles. This is nanotechnology. And they're set in a matrix, a bed of oxygen, silica, carbon. That is organic material. Organic material is what's added to explosives like TNT to expand rapidly because they turn into gases and they knock things over. That's how explosives work. Whereas incendiaries work by means of extreme heat. So here you have something that's been engineered to become more explosive. In fact, they do some research on this and they find, gosh, before 2001, Lawrence Livermore Lab developed this stuff. Explosive composites based on thermite reactions, whose fuel and oxidizer constituents are intimately mixed on the nanometer size scale. Well, my goodness. See, when you get this stuff so small, the surface volume increases exponentially. And the chemical reactions virtually instantaneous. They've engineered an incendiary to become more explosive. And just like the peer-reviewed literature from Lawrence Livermore Lab shows about this stuff, when you put them in a heater, a differential scanning calorimeter, they ignite and they measure the energy. And it's a lot of energy when they ignite. The paint doesn't do this. Wow. Well, that's exactly what their samples did. They ignite. And what do they produce, do you think, Bill, when they ignite? Molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres found in all the World Trade Center dust by the U.S. Geological Survey and R.J. Lee. So we know exactly where all those molten iron microspheres came from that the EPA couldn't identify, the USGS wouldn't, R.J. Lee wouldn't, but here they're found even attached to partially ignited red grade chips. It's very clear where all this molten iron microspheres came from. These.
And this had to be introduced from an outside agency. This wasn't something that was inherent with the building or just something out of nowhere just popped up. This was something that someone had to have placed in the building.
It's made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. Certainly not in a cave in Afghanistan. No. So they conclude, this is a 25-page peer-reviewed paper in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. The red layer's active, unreacted thermitic material, incorporating nanotechnology. And it's a highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive material. It was used to bring down the towers. So we have a set of repeatable experimental data that could be used in a court of law or a grand jury investigation to bring the real perpetrators to justice. But it's all been swept under the rug by NIST. Not a breath of it. We've given it to every congressman, and they've swept it under the rug also.
What about the insurance company, Richard? I mean, they paid out billions of dollars to Silverstein, for the destruction of these buildings.
We're going to look at the evidence of the destruction of the towers, at evidence which the insurance companies have also overlooked. And it turns out that they're actually involved in some of the put options, which is, of course, foreknowledge of this building's collapse, which we don't have time to go into today. But it's proof that millions and millions were made, probably a billion. They don't really know.
Well, I know we don't have a lot of time to get into it, but just give people a real brief executive summary of some of the tells in terms of the advanced knowledge that 9/11 didn't surprise some people.
Well, sure. In the case of Building 7, we have mysterious construction workers walking away from Building 7 in the early afternoon and hearing an explosion over their shoulder. This is on video. I didn't show it to you today. They look back at the building and then they look straight into the CNN camera and they're saying, "Did you hear that? That building's coming down." flame and debris coming down. The building's going to blow up. So they know Building 7's going to blow up before it ever does. The BBC announced.
And the thing we were seeing, Richard, going in is that we saw the World Trade Centers, and then off you got Building 7, like kind of out of nowhere. It was like non sequitur that would come down. And of course, they said, well, some beam or something had lit it up and melted it down, but it didn't. It has never made sense. Didn't make sense then, and still doesn't. Go ahead.
No, Chief Hayden says on camera in a documentary that they were worried about Building 7, so they didn't allow the firefighters to even go in there. Those few small scattered fires were easily attackable. Every firefighter will tell you that. But they were told not to go in there because the building is going to or could come down on its own. They used lots of different languages like that. And he said, well, we had an engineer put a transit on it because we saw a bulge. And we said to him, if we allow it to burn, would it come down and when? and the engineer says, yeah, you have about 5 hours before this building comes down. Wait a minute. No steel frame fire protected structures ever collapse due to fire. And now you're telling us it's going to come down in 5 hours. And it does after witnesses heard explosions. You can't get any better than that. And that's why we have 3,600 architects demanding a new investigation. You can see them at the website ae911truth.org. The architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, the organization I founded. Now Gail and I are on our own at Richard Gage 9/11 for the last 3 years, but we're working together with AE 9/11 Truth to get this evidence to the people. In fact, one of the projects I'm working with the Lawyers Committee for 9/11 Inquiry is the docufilm series 9/11 Crime Scene to Courtroom, taking hard evidence of 9/11 crimes to court. Mick Harrison, a litigation director for them, is working with me, and we were filmed in Washington, D.C. with our stand-in grand jurors presenting all of this evidence and a whole lot more. And we've just released last night, in fact, episode 3 of this series. You can see all the episodes at 911c2c.org. And so we're going to jump real quick into the Twin Towers before we run out of time, because we got to ask ourselves, if Building 7 was a controlled demolition, which was on 9/11 at the World Trade Center, is it possible that the Twin Towers could be also? In fact, just look at them here and shown simultaneously coming down because they're identical. Upward, outward arching streamers, a geometry of fireworks, freely flying structural steel sections weighing 4 and 8 tons, laterally ejected out of the towers at 80 miles an hour, clocked by physicists, landing 600 feet in every direction. This is not a collapse at all. This is a building blowing itself apart. And what is trailing those 4 and 8 ton structural steel perimeter sections that are freely flying? Aluminum oxide ash, the other byproduct of thermite in addition to molten iron. We'll come back to this in a second, but we have to ask ourselves, do the Twin Towers have the key features and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition? Well, let's take a look. Do we have a sudden onset of destruction? Yeah, the building is standing at rest, and all of a sudden, without hesitation, it travels straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the cold, hard steel below. There's no jolt, no hesitation, not even in the South Tower, as it begins its uniform, smooth transition. And we'll talk about how fast that is in a minute, too. We're told that the upper part destroys the lower part. But look, the upper part above the point of plane impacts is destroying itself. Look at the lower red line. This upper part is not intact, driving the rest of the building down to the ground. It's being destroyed itself. It's telescoping in on itself. The question is what's destroying it, and we've already gotten a hint of that because the evidence for incendiaries and And in this case, with the Twin Towers, explosives, high energy explosives also is what's operative here. If it were there, we'd see it. None of the photos, none of the videos show any such thing. If it were there, it would have driven these few remaining core columns that stand 7 feet in the air. That would have driven them down to the ground too. No, it looks more like a volcanic eruption. In fact, Bill, which one is the volcano and which one is World Trade Center 1? You can't tell. I can. It's not hard. It's the one on the right is the volcanic eruption. But we have outward arching streamers, a geometry of fireworks, freely flying solid molten objects trailed by thick white smoke clouds. So yes, aluminum oxide ash, the other byproduct of thermite. So we have witnesses, in fact, of explosions. Not one of these was included in any of the NIST official reports. And here's 156 of them. They claim to have interviewed 116 first responders and provided the essence of those in their 10,000 page report that took $20 million. Well, what do these guys say? Because Graham McQueen, the late professor, read every one of them. 12,000 pages of testimony. 156 of them are talking about were witnesses of stuff like this. We felt the ground shake. You could see the towers sway, and then it just came down. So you'll hear this order of events again and again. All of a sudden, the ground just started shaking. Felt like a train running under my feet. The next thing we know, we look up and the tower is collapsing. Shook my bones. Shortly before the first tower came down, I remember feeling the ground shaking. Heard a terrible noise, and then debris just started flying everywhere. These are expert witnesses. I saw a flash at the lower level of the building. You know, like when they demolish a building, I saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. And this is way down lower than the plane impacts. Right. These light sources, accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. I saw low-level flashes. I saw flash, and then it looked like the building came down. Saw a number of brief light sources being emitted from inside the building between floors 10 and 15. He saw about 6 of these brief flashes accompanied by a crackling sound before the tower collapsed. An explosion appeared at the very top simultaneously from all 4 sides. Material shot out horizontally, and then there seemed to be a momentary delay before you could see the beginning of the collapse. Wow. Not one of these are included in the NIST report.
And it's amazing. These are fire. These are first responders. These are credible individuals. We're not just, it wasn't like you went to the local bar and got somebody's perception of what happened here. I mean, these are credible statements from people there, firefighters and first responders that are giving, their eyewitness report.
Within a month after 9/11, orally recorded on tapes that the city withheld, and now we know why, until August of 2005. Then the New York Court State of Appeals forced the city to release these to the New York Times. They're on the website of the New York Times today for everybody to read. Is it a straight down symmetrical collapse? Feature number 3 of controlled demolition? Well, the South Tower actually begins to tip over. In fact, it's tipping over at 20 degrees. So we have asymmetrical damage from the planes, asymmetrical damage from the fires, asymmetrical damage certainly from this piece of the building that's falling off. How in the world then do we get complete symmetrical damage all the way around each face of this building? It makes no sense. Just like the firefighters were saying, it's like a belt all the way around, all these explosions, all 4 sides. In fact, you can see the leading corner of those explosions in this looped video. I see at least a dozen independent explosions. This is not like a nuclear weapon going off, right? These are independent, must be pre-placed explosions, cutter charges in the exterior of the building.
Mhm.
This building was only half occupied at most at the time of the collapse. And NIST actually verifies that inadvertently with their evacuation data. And so, and this isn't directed energy weapons, which soften steel, and according to those who theorize that, which there's no support for, those are independent explosives, and you can see them isolated here in feature number 4. They're called squibs in the controlled demolition industry. 20 stories down below, 40 stories down below the zone of destruction. We even see these squibs, isolated explosive ejections, 60 stories down below. There's no accounting for these whatsoever in the official narrative, so they don't discuss them. On the left side of the south tower, as it begins to lean to the right, we see in this looped video at least a dozen simultaneous isolated explosions, which appear to be destroying the rigid frame so it doesn't act as a rigid body and continue falling off the rigid body below onto the ground in some whole piece. No, it just settles back in on itself because its structure has been completely compromised, even while it is tipping to the right, because these are wireless explosives.
Right.
How fast is it coming down? Well, again, David Chandler and others calculated at 2/3 of free fall acceleration. That means it's accelerating. It's not slowing down when it meets the incredible structure below, more steel on the facade of this building than glass. No, so 90% of this steel had to have been removed in order for it to fall at 64% of free fall, 2/3 of free fall. No deceleration through 47 massive core columns. Should have slowed it down and stopped it, right?
Right, exactly.
200, that's intuitive. Common sense. 240 massive perimeter steel columns, 14-inch square steel tube columns. Well, what happened to those square steel tube columns? In this case, it's a very uncharacteristic feature because they are ejected, as we talked about, 600 feet in every direction, impaling themselves on skyscrapers all around the World Trade Center, destroying the Winter Gardens 600 feet away, landing in the Deutsche Bank building and damaging it so bad that it had to be taken down also. These are mammoth columns. It takes
now, did any of those buildings, were they ignited like 7 and got caught on fire?
Yes, building 7 and other buildings they're caught on fire. And we looked at those fires, and that was the cause of those fires inevitably. Think of it, molten iron dripping off the ends of these beams. That's the only thing that could catch building 7 or the other buildings on fire, because that's
these are like missiles flying in the air.
Yeah, it's an incendiary. Right? If they're burning at 4,000, they're burning at 4,000 degrees, and they're freely flying. Again, look, this is not like a banana peeling. Freely flying structural steel sections, 4 tons. That one's about to hit building 7. Back 2, forward 2. Wait a minute. What's it trailing? Thick white smoke clouds. Is steel flammable in office fire conditions? No. What's happening here? This is the aluminum oxide ash, and it's ejected horizontally. Well, how does gravity work? Down. What's going on here? Almost 90 degrees at its inception of its flight, and then gravity begins to take over, bring it to 45 degrees. There's enough energy here to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles. It's an incredible number of cannonballs that are being fired here. In fact, they're well outside the perimeter of World Trade Center 7. And by the way, if 100,000 tons of structural steel is distributed well outside of the footprint, we have to ask ourselves a very simple but troubling question. What's crushing that building? This is 1/3 of the weight of each tower that's not available to crush the building below if it's up to 600 feet outside the perimeter, right? Maybe it was the concrete. We got to look at the concrete because
we got Richard. We got a couple of minutes left here, so I'm gonna turn it over to you to kind of summarize and bring us home. To leave people with what's the next step? What do we do next?
Well, just to complete the concrete, we had 110 concrete floors, each an acre in size. Where are they? Well, they're not at the bottom. They're not stacked up like we see in Mexico in an earthquake, a real pancaking collapse. It's pulverized in midair. So neither is it available to crush the rest of the building because it's been distributed all the way across lower Manhattan. So we know we've been lied to by NIST. We know we have the 10 key features of controlled demolition. We know 3,600 architects know that we have to get to the bottom of this. We know that there are resources for us to do that at richardgage911.org, at ae911truth.org. Incredible resources. And you can download the outline of this entire presentation because we got to and print it and give it to everybody. We got to get to the truth. We got to draw the line somewhere. We don't just want to wait for the next 9/11. By the way, it happened during the last 4 years with the COVID false flag operation. These are false flag operations, Bill, and people have to wake up to what's really going on around us in our society, in our absence, our ignorance of the truth about what's really going on here.
Who benefited from this?
Well, we have the media benefited enormously. The arms industry benefited enormously. The banking cabal benefited enormously. All of these work together. They're interlocking boards of directorates. They control the media, the cheerleader for war, to achieve a purpose. What was the purpose? Many purposes. The tamp down on the control of the American people through the Patriot Act, the Military Commissions Act, National Defense Authorization Act of 2012. All of our phone calls, our emails, our texts are swept up systematically, stored in the largest building in Utah for use against us. And that's been done unconstitutional, all of it. The invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. Why? The opium production's 90% of the world's supply. It skyrocketed after we invaded the Taliban because they had shut it off and kicked them out. By the way, we just got kicked out after 14 years and they shut it down again to previous U.S. levels. Why did we invade Iraq? Well, it wasn't weapons of mass destruction. It wasn't ties to Osama bin Laden. It was a lot about oil, but also surrounding the enemy of the greater Israel, which is Iran, with 24 military bases. Wesley Clark told us this is the 7th country that's going to go down in 5 years. He was told by a top general who used to work for him in the Pentagon just 2 weeks after 9/11. Yemen, Libya, Lebanon, Syria, Sudan, all going to be taken down with Iran being the last. And Iran is the only one left.
Right, exactly. Well, Richard, we got to leave it there. And I mean, there's still so much left. And it's the old axiom, you follow the money. And we didn't even talk about Silverstein and what he had to gain from all this. But by comparison, what Silverstein got, was the American people that paid the greater price for this all. An infringement upon our liberties, as you said, weapons of mass destruction, not so, leads us into a war, and how many dead as a result of it. Unbelievable how the American people have been manipulated. Richard, thank you so much to you and the team and everybody else involved. Again, remind people where they can go for more information.
Well, I forgot to mention the firefighters for 9/11 Truth, firefighters911.org. They're banding together, demanding a real investigation of this evidence. They lost 343 of their own. So that's firefighters911.org, but also richardgage911.org and the petitioners you can see at ae911truth.org.
Richard Gage, again, thank you so much for being with us. Take care. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Today, ladies and gentlemen, we're just so blessed to have someone like us who is that puts the truth above all And that's what's most important, because the truth is where we find our freedom. Anywhere you remove truth, then your freedom is compromised. And this is what's happening, as he laid out. And look what's going on. This conspiracy that they want to say is a conspiracy has been going on, since 2001. Here we are 24 years later. And he laid out the information. So, what does that lead you to believe? And I don't blame you for lacking trust in our government and the institutions that are supposedly here to serve us. Well, we got to leave it there. Obviously, this will continue, and we'll have Richard back later on another day to even get further into this, because there's so much more still to unfold. But check out the website for more information. Again, thank you for being with us. I just pray you have a blessed day, and may God bless you and keep you. May his face, God's face, shine upon you and be gracious unto you and give you peace. Have a great day.